Appreciate you leading us in some prayer, Brother Michael. Thank you for that update, Brother Jason, with the Merlots. Before we get into the text, last week we started a brand new series entitled Reasons Why, and looked at 3 reasons why we use hymn-style music, and they all began with P's. Now you've slept 7 times since then, but can you help me with at least one of the P's from last week? One of the P's. Okay, help me out. I'm going to re-preach it if you don't. One of the P's from last week. Miss Pat? Praise? That's close. That would have fit. Next time I preach, it's going to be 4 points, sister. I like that. Praise. Danielle? Purpose. Yes, purpose. And there's also participation. I love it. You took notes. That's great. Others? Pointer. We're pointing to Him. And so the purpose is to build God's people up. We're pointing to Him. And then hymn style, it's easy to participate than if you just go with, the cutting edge style or a genre that's modern. It's hard to get everybody to participate in that. So those are 3 reasons. I also talked to you about the danger of paralysis by having words that don't match necessarily the music itself. And so that's a concern. Look at Galatians chapter 5. But this evening, I want to move on to a different aspect. Remember, we're viewing from the lens of you come in for the first time, and Hillview's a little different than the average church out there. And a couple things we observed, being in the mind's eye of a guest, is people dress up here. Why do they dress up? I mean, isn't this like a come-as-you-are church? Now, I want to be clear. I don't particularly enjoy wearing a tie. Brother Kevin, you and I are on the same page. I don't necessarily enjoy wearing a tie, but I do. And maybe you don't enjoy dressing up to come to church on Sunday morning or Sunday night or even Wednesday night, but we typically do. And the question I want to deal with tonight is, why? What is the underlying principle behind something like that? Now, this is going to be more than just clothing. I want to be clear. And what I'm going to do is tell you what the answer is not. Then we're going to look at the Bible and camp out there for about 30 minutes. And then I'll give you the answer to that question. How does that sound as a journey tonight? And so the question is, why would we dress up a little bit on Sunday morning or Sunday night or Wednesday night? The answer is not, well, because we want to give our best to God. You say, that's not the right answer? Well, I mean, that's not a bad reason, but that's not necessarily a biblical reason as far as we want to give our best to God. I mean, in our culture, you can give your best like Steve Jobs did, wearing a turtleneck and your Levi 501s every single day for your whole life, and that's your best, especially when you get up in front of everybody. And so your best isn't necessarily equal to just the clothing. It's something deeper than that as far as why we would even model that and even affirm that idea of people dressing up. So what's the answer to this? Well, turn to Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12. Let's get into this. I've entitled this, Why Reverence? And that's a word that we even see in this passage here. Why reverence? The background is a Jewish writer trying to communicate to some Jewish people to move on from the Old Testament sacrificial system and put their trust and faith totally in Jesus. He exalts faith in chapter 11. In chapter 12, he takes them back to Sinai in Exodus chapter 20 and says, hey, remember that account where that mountain was on fire and it shook? And after talking about that mountain, how the people trembled and how God spoke to Moses, we pick up in verse 28 and notice what the scriptures say. Wherefore, we receiving a kingdom which cannot be moved, let us have grace whereby we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear. For our God is a consuming fire. So, a couple of points I want to get to an overarching point, work this out practically, and then I'll answer that question that I asked out of the gate. So looking at the text, God gives clear reasons for reverence. God gives clear reasons for reverence. And you see that at the beginning of verse 28, and then you see that also in verse 29. And the first reason for reverence is security. We have an unwavering kingdom that's not going to fade away. That mountain trembled. To this day, people don't even know exactly where Mount Sinai is. There's speculation. You might open up in the map, the back section of your Bible, you see a little triangle showing Mount Sinai, but there's still speculation. Is that really the place or is it a different place? Because you can go and, well, there's multiple places. So the point is this, Mount Sinai, we don't even know where that is. That wasn't the unshakable kingdom. But in chapter 12, it talks about a kingdom that will never fade. It actually talks about believers being up in heaven and even refers to that as the ultimate church someday, the ultimate assembly in heaven someday. It says that's unshaken. And if you're part of that kingdom, you are secure, your identity doesn't waver, and therefore, because of what God has done, given you security, that's reason to respond with reverence and respect towards Him. But then there's another reason. In verse 29, it says, "For our God is a consuming fire." That's referring to God's holiness. God is a jealous God. The first time we really see the idea of God being a fire expounded upon is Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 24. I'd encourage you to write that reference down. It says that our God is a consuming fire. This is actually a direct quote from that. And it says, "For I am a jealous God." In other words, I have no rivals. I burn other rivals up. And that pictures how God is not just jealous, but He's other than anything else. And the word that we use for other than is holy. That makes God very distinct. You see the same idea with God burning throughout the camp of Israel in Numbers chapter 11, verse 1. You see that again in Numbers chapter 16, verse 35. I won't digress with all those stories, but you see examples of that throughout the history of Israel. And you even see this idea of God being a fire in the form of judgment, because our holy God will judge the world. And back in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 31, He even stated, "It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God." Because often throughout the Scriptures, you find that fire is symbolic with judgment. But it goes back to this core nature of God. He is holy. He is other than. And He burns up anything else in His presence that does not match up to that holiness. And you see that throughout the Scriptures. So God gives clear reasons for reverence. But then in the middle of verse 28, we see that God provides simple instructions based on that reverence. Some simple instructions. And there's a twofold instruction. The first one in verse 28 is that we ought to be graceful. We ought to be graceful. What does that mean? Well, look at what it says. "Let us have grace whereby we may serve God acceptably." That word graceful is where we get the word charis. We often use that for charismatic. In other words, these people are believing the gifts. But it's also translated as grateful. My heart is responding with grace by saying thank you for all that you have done. And so really what it's saying is the reverent instruction is, if God has done all this for me, then I ought to live a life that constantly says, thank you, God. Thank you for all that you have done. It's interesting, the psalmist multiple times talks about offering sacrifice to God, but he doesn't say bullocks and oxen and lambs. He says, offer now the sacrifice of praise or of thanksgiving. And that lines up perfectly with what the writer of Hebrews is saying right here. Let us have grace. But then it doesn't just talk about having grace, but grace to do something. With a grateful heart, we ought to serve God acceptably. In other words, we ought to fit Him. We ought to be appropriate. Well, what's the appropriate way? With reverence and godly fear. These two phrases or words are at least cousins, if not even synonyms. And they're referring to the idea of respect, honor, even terror at times. It's picturing a way of life. And that word serve is an interesting word because it is the only way the word worship is translated after Jesus ascends into heaven in the New Testament. Jesus used the word proskuneo, which means to bow the knee. Paul never used that word. He used the word latruo, which has the idea of worshiping as a way of life. That's the word that the writer uses right here. We ought to just worship God as a way of life. How? With reverence and godly fear. It's the opposite of flippancy. Another synonym for the idea of reverence is do so with caution. Be careful how you worship Him. Take it very seriously. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 17, Peter wrote, "And if ye call on the Father, who without respect of persons judgeth according to every man's work, pass the time of your sojourning here in fear." Not in happiness, not in joy, fear. Respect. Take it seriously is what he's saying. So bringing all this together, God gives clear reasons for reverence. God provides simple instructions. Let us be graceful, serve God reverently. But the main point I want you to see in these two verses is God's unshakable kingdom and holy nature inspire reverence. That's the foundation to take the Christian life seriously, according to what the writer, under inspiration of God, is saying. So what does this look like? Well, I think we have an example of this in Exodus chapter 3. You have Moses that is watching sheep on the backside of the desert, and as he's coming around a bend, he sees a bush that is on fire, but it's not being consumed. Well, he sees that because the leaves are not withering, being consumed, he does a double take. And as soon as he peers a little closer, he hears a voice out of the bush. "Moses, Moses." And he draws near to hear what's going on. And the command is, "Take off your sandals, for you're on holy ground." And according to Exodus chapter 3, we find Moses on his face, showing respect and reverence. You see the combo there? God appears as a fire. There's a response of respect and ultimate surrender. Whatever you want, God. And from there, God called him to go to Egypt. Of course, he kicked and fought a little bit, making some excuses in Exodus chapter 3 and 4. But nonetheless, God called Moses, and it was that encounter and the response of reverence that God used to get a hold of Moses to call him back to his people in Egypt. So what does this look like specifically? If we're going to live reverently, how does this play out in our daily lives? So I want to look at 3 different areas what this would look like in your life and in my life. The first area is our private lives. That's where it really begins. That's the real you. It's not church life. I mean, I see who you are, but the people that we are in a pew on a Sunday evening or a Wednesday evening is not really the real us. It's who we are late at night, all alone, and early in the morning, when nobody's looking, and the thought process in our mind. And so how does reverence manifest itself in our private lives? Well, if we live reverently in our private lives, it will instill character in every aspect of our lives. Let me say that one more time. If we are respectful towards our God in our private lives, over time it will instill character because we know that God is always watching us. By the way, Mom and Dad, that's great to teach your kids reverence at an early age, and the fact that God is all-knowing. Hey, He's watching you when nobody else is in the kitchen. There's cookies up in the cabinet, son. That's reverence that you're instilling in your child, or you're in your grandchild, or your niece or your nephew. And so reverence is really foundational for character, that awareness that God is always watching us. He's watching our thoughts. Also, this affects our private lives and our devotions. If we're living reverently in our private lives, we don't just roll out of bed in the morning and then we just kind of sit down on the sofa, kick our legs up, and open up our Bible and hope that God just kind of starts speaking to us. We realize that this is serious, and we stop and we acknowledge God for who He is, and possibly confess our unworthiness and our need for Him. And then once we have engaged our heart in the right way towards Him, then we bring our request to Him or open up the Scriptures and we ask Him to speak to us. It also affects on how we do things like parenting and even how we approach marriage. Hey, mom and dad, God does not need you to parent your kids. Have you ever thought about that? God does not need you. No, you need Him for you to parent your kids. And we get that reversed sometimes. All of us are disposable, but we need Him. And that goes back to this idea of reverence, that I take this seriously and I need Him. And I want to be respectful towards Him in every aspect of my life, including how I approach my spouse, including how I approach my kids, and how I approach parenting, my grandkids, and my coworkers, and my boss, and even those that are maybe direct reports under me. And I just want to do this reverently before God. So our private lives is the first area. Another area is our church life. Our church life. When it comes to our church life, some of this isn't necessarily a big deal. I just want to explain maybe the underlying reason why we do that. You'll notice when you come into the sanctuary, it says no drinks or beverages. Well, why? Because we don't want to have a cafe feel when people come in to hear preaching. We want them to take it a little bit more seriously than a cafe or coffee shop. And that goes back to we're all in focusing on this. Hey, the cafe feel is afterwards with the cookies out in the fellowship hall. And that's intentional. The preaching's not going on at that point. The worship is not taking place formally at that point. And so that would be one way we show that reverence is, and by the way, if you see a guest maybe slipping, they don't know any better, hey, just focus more on being friendly to them than the fact that they have a drink in the sanctuary. That'll go further just by being kind and friendly. And if they continue to come, they'll get it, such as some recent guests who have come. You notice they might have had a drink the first time or two they came, but now they don't have drinks anymore. Those things kind of just work themselves out, and they pick up on that over time. And so we don't necessarily need to police that, but it's something that we need to be aware of ourselves and model that. That this isn't a cafe. This is something where we're coming in to hear the preaching of the Word. Also, another way is at the invitation time. We show respect by responding to the preaching and humbling ourselves. That's how we say, I'm serious about this. I want to act upon this in my life. Another way is even how we select leaders at Hillview Baptist Church. Wow, a living person came in and he's actually married. They're not living together. Hey, can you be our youth pastor? No, we don't approach it that way. Because we believe that overseers and those that are in a leadership position, whether a pastor or a deacon, or even people that would be directors in our church, we take that seriously. There's been a track record of faithfulness. They've stewarded well what they've been given. Those that are in the more spiritual office of pastor and deacon, according to 1 Timothy chapter 3, has a whole line of prerequisites before they would be considered for that position. And you can read about those. We preached on those in months and years gone by. And so that's another way we show reverence is even holding leadership to a certain standard and bar. And by the way, it's not impeccability, because if that's the case, man, I'm disqualified as your pastor because I'm still a sinful man in the need of the grace of God. But when we look at the character traits and the high calling of spiritual leaders, we realize, boy, God takes this seriously. And so that's another way we show this idea of reverence in church. So you have private lives, we have church life, but then also we have interaction with others. Interaction with others. As we're out and about, God might come up. And a reverent way to bring up God is not by saying, oh yeah, the old man upstairs, or even just my higher power. But no, that's my Father. It's my God. And I need Him. And of course, that helps us stay away from the blasphemy of OMG that people seem to use so flippantly out there, which if you really want to get down to it, that is more heart-wrenching to the heart of God than even a lot of four-letter words. Not that I'm condoning four-letter words, but using God's name blasphemously is not, that is going against Scripture there. And so we just hold the name of God with respect as we talk about Him. That yes, He's near me, I have a relationship with Him, but I don't just throw His name around flippantly out of frustration or anger. So our interaction with others. When the problems come up and people are trying to solve them, and maybe we're talking about our own problems, we can talk with respect as far as, man, I'm thankful for the grace of God in my life because He's made such a difference in me. That shows respect, shows reverence. So interaction with others is the third area. So I hope this gives you an idea what this reverence looks like in our daily lives. Now let's go back around to that original question that I asked. Why do we dress up to come to church? That's one of the first things that people know. And before I even give the answer, we don't make it as big of a deal as the first-time guest probably thinks it is when they come in because they're very self-conscious. I want to put that in perspective there. But here's the answer. The answer is we dress up a notch to communicate to others that we take this seriously. That's why I wear a tie to preach, because I'm serious about it. When I was studying for 3 hours in my office this morning, I didn't wear a tie. Oh, I was taking it seriously, but nobody cared because nobody was watching me study. I don't need to wear a tie. Now, let me clarify that answer a little bit because it communicates to others that I take this seriously. You see, what I wear does not bring me closer or further from God. Can I just be very blunt? God doesn't care what you wear. You say, well, show me a chapter and verse in the Bible that God is really consumed with clothing and what somebody is wearing in the New Testament. Okay, they made sure the priests had breeches so that when they went up, they were modest and people weren't looking up their robe. Okay, I get it. God focused on clothing a time or two in the Old Testament. But clothing does not draw us closer to God or make us further, but it communicates to others and as a result gives a spirit of, hey, we're taking this seriously. This isn't just like watching cartoons on Saturday morning, sipping coffee. This isn't just gaming like at 10 o'clock at night. This is for real. And I want to show that and communicate that to others. Now, in this idea of reverence, particularly clothing and some of the things we do, such as drinks in the sanctuary and the more traditional approach that we have at church, we got to be aware of some ditches. And here are some ditches we need to avoid in our own heart. One is over-spiritualizing the externals, such as attire. You say, what do you mean over-spiritualizing? Well, viewing clothing as revealing of where somebody is spiritually. Now, some of you you're tattooed up from your past life. I'm glad God doesn't grade your spirituality based on the markings of your body at this point in your new life. Aren't you thankful for that? And we can over-spiritualize, the outward appearance if we're not careful. And God knows where we were when we made that decision and where we are now when we're moving forward for the glory of God. And so we got to be careful of over-spiritualizing attire that, that person's dressed up, they must be really mature in Christ. Well, I've seen some people dress up in a coat and tie and their life was in tatters. I've seen ladies, man, wow, that's impeccable dress, that skirt, that attire, that dress they're in. And man, their life was just a mess. Nowhere close to mature in their walk with God. You've seen people like that. So we can't over-spiritualize some of these things. That's a ditch we got to watch out for. Also, here's probably a bigger ditch we ought to avoid. With the idea of stepping up in our seriousness, we can be overly stiff if we're not careful. There's been some times I've gone into a restaurant, it's a nice restaurant, you're supposed to dress up. I get nervous, man. It's like stiff. Like, am I using the right fork here? And, okay, outside in, right? Outside in. Okay, I'm using the right fork. And wait, that was actually for the salad. And boy, that's kind of stiff in that environment. That's not what we want at Hillview Baptist Church. But by dressing up, if we're not careful, we can become stiff. So how do we overcome the stiffness? Well, going back to our hospitality series at the beginning of the year, we go up to anybody that we don't know, and we get to know them. We make them feel at home. We talk about our lives. We're authentic, and we tell them we're so glad that they came, and if we've hit it off with them, we might even invite them to sit next to us. That's the opposite of stiffness. And so we got to combat the idea of taking it so seriously that we're stiff by making sure that we're warm and welcoming to the people that are around us. And then there's also just that ditch that always raises its ugly head no matter where we venture in the Christian life. It's called pride. It's called pride. How does that manifest itself? Oh, I hope people notice how I'm dressed today. Hey, look how many people comment how nice my dress is. That's pride. Let's focus on yourself. And by the way, if you're drawing a lot of compliments to how you are dressed, you might consider toning down your dress a little bit, because you might be drawing too much attention to yourself, if that's the case. Just be careful of pride, because our attire can bring pride if we're not careful. Going back to Steve Jobs, I was reading about him recently. He would wear the same attire every single day. You know, that's somewhat tempting. You don't have to worry about it. Make the decision as far as there's more important things to decide on, like other than what I'm going to wear. It wasn't a big deal of Steve Jobs and others out there in the business world. And so it's that idea of it shouldn't consume me as far as what I'm actually wearing, but I'm going to dress up a notch to communicate to others. And then I'm just going to serve God with a passion and be all in. So bringing all this together, why do we dress up? Why are we more of a traditional church? Because in our culture, we just want to have this way of communicating that we're serious about church. This isn't something that we just do flippantly or casually. We're all in on this thing. I think a great example of that is not necessarily a church setting officially painted in the Bible, but in Luke chapter 5. Jesus was teaching, and Peter, Andrew, James, and John were washing their nets on the seashore. They should have been cleaning fish, not their nets. And Jesus looked at them after sending the multitude away and said, "Launch into the deep. Let down your nets for a draught." "But Lord, we fished all night and caught nothing." Go. They go out there. They let their nets down. Their nets almost begin to break. Peter and Andrew are hopping in their boats to help James and John. They come together. They pull this huge school of fish onto the shore. And impulsively, Peter jumps out of the boat, splashes through the remaining level in the Sea of Galilee up to Jesus, falls on his face and says, "Lord, depart from me. I'm a sinful man." What is Peter doing? He's responding reverently to what he just saw from his Messiah, Jesus. How does Jesus respond to that? He says, "From henceforth thou shalt catch men." And it says that he left everything, left the business with his dad, with James and John's dad, Zebedee, and he followed Jesus. So let me put it another way. Reverence, embraced properly, leads to surrender to God, being all in. In other words, we can fake reverence all day, but if our heart is not in, it's a phony reverence. And so the challenge of this text and from this message is reverence is about respect towards God so that we're surrendered to whatever He wants in our lives. So that if God says, "Hey, I want you to go to the Middle East to reach Muslims," I'm willing to go, Lord. If you want me to be part of a church planning team to go up to Corvallis or to Cresswell or to Junction City, Lord, I'm all in doing that. Lord, if you want me to go and surrender my life to pursue a ministry abroad, I'm willing to do that. You moms, you say, "God, if you want to send my kids to a dangerous country where they can spread the gospel, Lord, they're your kids. I'm surrendered to whatever you want me to do." That is the fruit of heart surrender. And may God deepen that in our church so that reverence in our hearts leads to surrender just like we saw in the Apostle Peter. Let's go and stand with the heads bowed and eyes closed.